tell, do you see the road? I'm out to my soul into the sides whenever the smoke clear out of my face and my picture perfect. Do it.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 5th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets Twilight? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Asian Lion Heart 310 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Days after he asked Bella to be his girlfriend, Harold's life seemed to be complete. He felt like he could climb the highest mountain without breaking a sweat. All thanks to his girlfriend and soulmate, Isabella Swan. Bella loved him and he loved her, and they didn't care if they showed it a bit too much. At Forks High School, when the news reached the other students, opinions about it were different. Many of the boys were jealous at Harold for having Bella, while the girls were upset that the dark brown-haired young man had been taken by the new schoolgirl. Jacob Black had been a bit upset himself as he loved Bella, but he accepted it as he was friend with Harold. Yes, their relationship grew a bit more since their meeting. Jacob and Harold acted like siblings, with sometimes with the dark brown-haired young man being the tallest. Bella Swan, sadly, became even more popular at the school because she managed to tame the scary guy, as the boys called Harold, mainly because of his icy glares. 2 girls among them soon became good friends to her. Their names? Angela Weber and Jessica Stanley. Angela was 6 feet tall young woman with light brown hair with streaks of honey and brown eyes. Jessica, for her part, wasn't very tall, 5 feet 1 inch height, but she had voluminous curly dark brown hair and blue eyes. Of the 2, she was a real chatterbox. Harold, even if he didn't like the latter of lot, decided that it wasn't his problem if his girlfriend wanted to befriend them. Besides, she also needed girlfriends and not just Jacob and him. The Cullens, for their part, were still wondering about to think of these 2. The vampires knew what Harold might be but couldn't help but at least be happy for him. Alice had found the 2 really cute when they arrived at school hand in hand. Heck, Rosalie, who disliked Harold because he was part bear, admitted that it was pretty cute. Emmett and Jasper had just shrugged, knowing that it would happen eventually, seeing how close those 2 were. Edward, him, was furious. He coveted Bella ever since he first saw her in the cafeteria, but this thing took her away from him. He hadn't told his family about this as he knew what Carlisle would tell him. Leave her alone, Edward. We do not want troubles with the Werbear, especially if she is his chosen. But he refused to let her go. Bella Swan was his. And no one else. Unfortunately for him, one of his siblings had noticed his behavior and had been keeping a close eye on him. It was Alice Cullen, wife of Jasper, and the seer of the family. Indeed, the pixie-like vampire had the power to see future. And she had seen Edward being killed by Harold after the former tried to force Bella to do something. This vision happened to him the moment she entered the school and see the look in Edward's eyes. Alice, since that moment, decided to keep an eye on him so this vision doesn't happen. She loved her family and she didn't want it to see it broken because of an obsessed brother, adoptive or not. The best course of action was to warn the 2 targeted people, even if it meant creating a bigger tension between Harold and Edward. She decided to wait for the right time to act, but first she had to at least tell Carlisle. That's bring us to present. And to be more precise, at Cullen House during the middle of the evening. Esme, Carlisle and Alice, along with Jasper and Rosalie, were discussing the seer's vision while Emmett and Edward went out to hunt. Are you sure of this, Alice? The head of the family asked his adoptive daughter with pain and horror in his tone. Esme looked ready to cry if she still could. Yes, and seeing how Edward watched Bella, Alice replied softly before shivering at the souvenir of his possessive golden eyes. What are we going to do, Carlisle? Jasper asked his adoptive father with some worry. Easy, we have to prevent it to happen, but knocking some senses into Edward's head. Rosalie said from her place. She might be narcissistic and self-centered, but she loyal to her family and would do anything to protect it. It would not work. Edward is too stubborn, Jasper replied with a shrug and a sigh. Well then we have no choice, Carlyle inquired with a small sigh of worry. Which is? Esme asked her husband with a hint of concern and curiosity. We have to warn them, Carlyle responded gravely, and a silence followed his words. I will do it. I'm the least intimidating physically, Alice volunteered with a determined tone in her voice. Are you sure? Esme asked her with maternal worry. She is indeed the best for the job. Harold might be terrifying, but he seems to be reasonable, Jasper said in defense of his wife. Maybe I can accompany you just in case, Rosalie inquired to her sister, who shook her head in response. No, maybe it is better if it's only one of us. Carlyle and Esme nodded in agreement before dismissing their children when they felt Emmett and Edward returning back. The two parents glanced at one another, thinking about Alice's vision. Esme. Yes, dear. Maybe we should make a treaty with Harold Anderson, Carlyle suggested to his wife, who nodded in agreement. At the same time, the dark brown-haired young man we loves, was baking his specialty, honey cake. It was one of the many cakes Astrid would do for him when he lived with her, and apparently it was Werber's specialty. Speaking of Astrid, she had been thrilled when he told her about him and Bella being together, but had been disappointed by the fact he hadn't told her about them being soulmates. To calm down his mother, he had promised to tell Bella soon, seeing that was growing more and more suspicious of him and the vampires. Back to present, Harold was pulling cake out of the oven when he heard someone knocking at his door. I'm coming, he said loudly to whoever it was before quickly putting his cake down to rush toward the door. When he opened it, he was stunned to see his girlfriend Bella standing there, smiling up at him. Sakna Swan. What can I do for you on this fine evening? He asked her with a charming grin. Bella grinned back mischievously at him before responding in a playful tone. Maybe let me in, Mr. Anderson. It had become something of a game between them. He would purposely call her Lady Swan and she would retaliate by calling him Mr. Anderson, and just to annoy one another. Of course, milady, come enter my humble abode, Harold playfully inquired her while stepping aside with a little bow. Bella rolled her eyes at his behavior but play along with it as she haughtily responded. Thank you, noble sir. With that they both chuckled as the young woman entered the wooden house. Harold had barely the time to close the door before soft lips pressed against his. Bella had lunged at him to kiss him. Who was he to not respond in kind? They kissed for a full minute before pulling themselves away from one another to catch their breath. What are you doing here, love? Not that I mind your presence, of course, Harold asked her with a raised brow. Charlie allowed me to stay with you for the night as long as we don't do anything stupid, the young woman answered with a shrug. The dark brown-haired young man chuckled in amusement. Leave it to Charlie to think he would do such things. But Harold could understand that the mustached sheriff was worried for his daughter. Astrid would have probably done the same in this situation. Well then, mi casa es tu casa, as the saying goes, Harold replied with a grin which caused her to roll her eyes in fond amusement. My. Thank you, noble sir, Bella retorted mockingly as she entered the living room with a smirk on her heart-shaped face. Chuckling, Harold then re-entered the kitchen where his cake was cooling a bit. Want some cake, love? He asked her loudly from the kitchen. Cake. Bella's scream echoed from the living room before she suddenly appeared right in front of him with stars in her chocolate eyes. Blinking at how fast she came, he couldn't help the laugh of amusement from escaping his throat. Well, look, like this is my answer, he commented with a grin which caused Bella to realize what she did as she blushed madly in embarrassment. Smirking, the dark brown-haired young man cut 2 parts of the cake before handing one to his beloved soulmate. Here you go, Sakna Swan, he said to her with his charming smile. Thank you, Mr. Anderson, Bella replied back with a playful grin of her own before the two slowly enjoyed the cake. The second the young woman bit on her part, a loud humming sound erupted from her throat and Harold glanced at her with a raised brow. So good, Bella squealed softly in delight after she swallowed. Thank you, milady, I aim to please, Harold retorted with a soft smile, his ego boosted a bit at this point. Oh really? Bella inquired him with a strange glint in her eyes. So you wouldn't mind answering some of my questions, right? Harold, who was savoring his cake, froze dead on the spot as those words reached his eyes and swallowed nervously as he glanced at his smirking girlfriend. She got him. The dark brown-haired young man wanted to object but then thought about it. He could kill two birds with one stone, telling her of their true relationship and telling her about werbears, vampires, and shifters. The problem was how she would take the news. He was afraid that she would reject him forever and making sure to never see him again. Harold knew that he couldn't live if his soulmate hated him. Besides, he made a promise to his mom to tell Bella everything. Now he had to respect it for the better or worse. Taking a deep breath, the blue-green-eyed young man slowly looked back at his girlfriend who was patiently waiting for an answer. "All right, what do you want to know?" Her face literally brightened at his question and Harold couldn't retain a smile from forming on his face at how happy she looked at the moment. However, she seemed to be thinking about which question to ask him first. "Well, how did you manage to stop them then?" Bella asked him after a moment of thinking. Of course she would ask this. Harold thought about this with a deep sigh. "Well, here we go. Well, this is a long story, but first, have you ever heard of werbears?" he asked in a serious tone. Time skip. A few moments later, Bella was looking at her boyfriend with a look filled with disbelief and amazement once he finished his explanation. The two of them were in the living room, seating on the sofa and drinking some coffees Harold prepared at one point. "So let me get this straight, you are a werbear?" the young woman inquired after a moment of stunned silence. "Yes," Harold responded calmly while drinking a bit of coffee. "Vampires, werewolves and wizards exist." "Yes again. So does many other fantastical creatures." "Hum hum. Your people was kicked out of their home because they could turn into bears." "Indeed. Your kind had been hunted by wizards and church members." "Yes. Then they went in war with werewolves and vampires. First the wolves, then the vampires, but yes again. And since, you coexist in peace." "Kind of, but yes." "And you are saying 2 out your 3 enemies are here in Forks?" "Yes." Bella stayed silent as she putted her head between her hands, thinking about what she just learned. Her boyfriend wanted to comfort her but forced himself to stay where he was, knowing she needed time to process those new informations. "The Cullens are really vampires?" the young woman asked him in a soft tone. "Yes, but from what I heard, they feed on animal blood," Harold responded to her calmly but in a gentle tone. The look of confusion and disbelief she sent him caused him to chuckle a bit. "Yes, I found it strange too, but so far, no one's dead in Forks," the blue-green-eyed young man replied to her. "Who are the wolves?" "Honestly, I don't know. I didn't have any more encounter with them during my patrols, but I did smell the faint trace of wolf on your friend." Bella blinked at those words before asking with curiosity, "Which one?" "Jacob," Harold replied calmly while drinking a bit of coffee. "What?" Bella cried out in shock. "I didn't say he is a wolf, Bella. I just say I smelt wolf on him. Maybe he knows someone who is actually one," Harold explained gently to Bella, who relaxed a bit. Why did she reacted like that? Easy, because she didn't want to see her friends getting hurt. Jacob and Harold seemed to get along with if the former was a werewolf, or shifters as her boyfriend called them. She didn't want to think about it. "You know, you are surprisingly calm about all of this," Harold suddenly said to her with a hint of amazement in his tone. "Give me a break. I just learn of things many would think are impossible." Bella mock glared at him and he laughed in response. "Harold," she suddenly called out for him in an unsure tone. "Yes. There is another thing I want to ask you." Now she looked really embarrassed. "Go on," he suddenly felt like something big was going to be said. "You said something earlier about soulmates. How do you know when someone is your one and only?" Bella asked him in a soft tone as if she didn't want him to hear. "Well, it's complicated to explain, but in short, you felt more drawn to this person as if without him or her, you have no reasons to live anymore," Harold explained in a soft tone of his own. Bella's eyes widened a bit as she seemed to remember something. "Does someone feel a shiver if we see our soulmate?" After a long moment of silence, Harold's only answer was a soft, yes. Another long silence followed after that. The dark brown-haired young man's eyes were trying not to look at Bella, in fear of seeing anger or outrage in them. "Harold," he heard her calling out for him in a serious tone. "Yes." "Look at me," she ordered him in a gentle and firm tone. Compelled to listen, Harold turned his head and was stunned to see her own face inches away from his. Blue-green eyes met chocolate eyes as Bella asked in a curious tone. "Be trustful with me, are we soulmates?" Harold hesitated to answer, but seeing the kind look in those gorgeous chocolate eyes of hers he knew he couldn't lie to her, so he gathered all his courage to say, "Yes." A second after those words left his lips, Bella lunged at him to kiss the hell out of him, and Harold instantly returned the gesture. Both of them felt good on the inside after those revelations, and none of them wanted to let go. "Why didn't you told me earlier?" she asked him gently once she pulled her lips away from his. I was afraid of your reaction. I was afraid you would never see me again," Harold responded bashfully. He received another kiss on the lips in response, but it lasted a few seconds as Bella stared at him dead in the eyes. "I'm shocked and surprised, yes, but I am not that rude," she replied to him in a firm tone. "I am an idiot, aren't I?" Harold chuckled at those words as he shook his head in self-embarrassment. "Yes, you are Harold Anderson," Bella playfully retorted to him before kissing him again on the lips. They stayed like this for a few seconds before they pulled away from one another. "Harold, can I see this forms of yours?" Bella asked him with a bit of excitement and curiosity. "Are you sure?" her boyfriend asked her with some worry. "Yes, I want to see the real you," the young woman cooed back before kissing him on the lips. "I don't want to scare you." "I won't be, because I know that, even if you are in another form, it is still you." Smiling tenderly at his soulmate, Harold nodded his head at her and she released a soft squeal in response. Amused by her behavior, Harold led her outside, into the clearing in front of his house. "All right, you should step aside. I will change into my humanoid bear form first." Bella nodded as she stepped a few feet away from him, her eyes showing nothing but interest, curiosity, and slight excitement. Harold closed his eyes and barely a second later, his body started to shift. Bella's eyes widened when she saw her boyfriend growing bigger and more muscular as fur started to appear on his skin. Barely a few seconds later, where previously stood her boyfriend now stood something else. Harold was now almost 4 meters tall and mostly covered in dark brown fur except the fur around its neck, which was lighter in color. His head was entirely bear-like, as was his feet. His hands were clawed, but they still looked human-like. His body was even more muscular than it was in his human form, and Bella couldn't retain a blush at the sight of those bulging muscles of his. His torso was also well definite. Then she looked at where the eyes should be and was a bit pleased to see the familiar blue-green eyes she grew to love. The young woman felt like an ant before this tall beast. Bella, the humanoid bear, called out to his girlfriend in a deep voice. "Nice muscles," the young woman commented as she looked at his arms. "Thank you," the beast began to say in his deep voice before it turned lighter as he turned back into the young man she fell in love with. "Now my full form, please don't be scared of me," Harold gently inquired his girlfriend, who gave him a peck on the lips. "I wasn't afraid of your previous form, why should I be afraid of this one?" Bella asked him mischievously. "You will see why, but first turn around," her boyfriend retorted back with a grin. "Why?" she asked him with a curious raised brow. "It would be telling," Harold answered back with a grin. "Don't you dare stare at my peach." Bella hissed at him with a mad blush on her face. "I would never do such things," Harold began to say in protest before smirking evilly as he added. "Well, not without your permission at least." "Idiot." Bella punched him on the chest as she turned around in embarrassment, not looking at her laughing boyfriend as her face was as red as a tomato. Harold then quickly closed his eyes before gritting his teeth as Ho's body moved again. Bella, whose back was turned toward him, could clearly hear the sound of moving bones along with little pops that sent tiny shivers running through her body. A few seconds later, the strange sound stopped and silence followed. The young woman wanted to turn around but she waited her boyfriend's signal. She barely released a sigh that something gently pocked her again and again. "Hey, what are yo dash?" Bella hissed in irritation as she turned around to give her boyfriend a piece of her mind only to froze as she stared at the biggest bear she had ever seen. On its 4 legs, this ursine was already taller than her as he stood 8 feet tall. Covered in dark brown fur, except the neck, the bear's blue-green eyes looked at her for a second before tightening his head to the side, releasing a little growl. Harold. Bella called out softly in shock as she looked at the massive creature before her. A nod came from the bear and the young woman slowly reached out for his head as if she wanted to touch him. Harold didn't move and soon growled in pleasure when he felt her hand touching his fur. Bella blinked at how soft it felt to the touch and soon she started to caress him and to her joy, he seemed to enjoy it. "Amazing," she whispered softly to herself as she petted her boyfriend-turned-bear. Suddenly, the massive bear's muzzle lowered itself between her legs and, before she had the time to yelp in surprise at the intrusion, he tossed his head back, sending her in the air. "Oof." The chocolate-eyed young woman grunted when she fell on something soft but hard and looking down to see that she was on the bear's back. Slowly positioning herself correctly on the beast's furred back, she gave him a light slap which caused him to growl a bit in surprise and slight pain. "Don't ever do this again." Bella hissed at him in a serious tone and he growled softly back at her as if saying, "Yes ma'am." Harold then left the clearing to enter the forest and Bella seemed to realize what he wanted to do, giving her a ride. "You could have just asked, you know," she grumbled to him and in his eyes, she could clearly see the mischief in them which caused her to pout at him cutely. Pressing her head against his warm fur, the young woman sighed at how soft it felt against her skin and simply enjoyed the incredible moment as they made their way through the forest with the sky slowly turning darker as the night approached. When they returned, Bella, who had loved the ride, now had one idea passing in her head, becoming a werebear. Time skip. 2 days later, Bella was no more in his home. However, Harold did have visitors but this time it was neither Bella or Charlie. But from people he never met before. One of them, who was in a wheelchair, looked strangely like an older version of Jacob while the other was an inch taller than himself and was younger than his companion. He had copper skin, cropped black hair and brown eyes along rounded muscles. "Yes." Harold greeted them in a calm but stern tone. He had been slept pretty late last night because of schoolwork and was not in a good mood. It didn't help when one of his visitors literally reeked of wolf. Usually, he would have chased them away but he would never harm someone weaker than him. And seeing that one of his visitors was in a wheelchair. The older man glanced at his companion before asking, "Are you Harold Anderson?" "I am. Who's asking?" "My name's Billy Black. I'm Jacob's father," the wheelchaired man responded in a somewhat nervous tone but tried his best to not show it too much. "I figured you look like him but older," Harold retorted with a tiny grin. Billy chuckled a bit in amusement before his expression turned serious again when Harold asked them with narrowed eyes. "How did you find me and what do you want?" His tone was sharp and his eyes were firmly on the youngest of his visitors who tensed at his gaze. "Charlie, your girlfriend's father, is my best friend. When he came to visit me the day before, he told me a lot about you. You made a good impression on him and my son of course," Billy explained to the dark brown-haired young man before him. Harold didn't respond but silently cursed Charlie for speaking about him to complete strangers. Jacob, he could understand, but Charlie? "Your point?" Harold asked him with narrowed eyes. The young man accompanying Billy Sam bristled at the sharp tone but before he could lunge at the younger man, Billy stopped him with a hand. "I will be blunt. Are you a werebear?" Billy asked him with a hint of hope. Harold and Sam both blinked at the unexpected question. The former was surprised by Billy's words while Sam looked at his elder with confusion and stupor. "Yes, I am. How do you know?" The dark brown-haired young man replied after a moment with an indifferent tone. "I might not be a shifter like Sam here but I know the legend and story of my people very well, Mr. Anderson," Billy responded casually. "I see. Now give me one good reason to not kick the dog out of my domain." Harold asked the wheelchaired man with a growl. Sam gritted his teeth at the challenge, looking ready to transform right there and then, but once again couldn't when Billy shot him a vicious glare that forced him to stand down. Nodding at his elder, Sam then looked back at the younger man with a scowl on his face. Harold sneered back at him defiantly in response before looking back at Billy when the old man said those words. "Mr. Anderson, if I am here today, it is to possibly make a peace treaty with you to prevent bloodshed." Harold was stunned by those words as he didn't saw it coming, but then his blue-green eyes narrowed again as he said back in a cold tone. "There is already a treaty between our kinds if I remember correctly." "There is indeed, but I still want peace between you Mr. Anderson and us, shifters," Billy replied back with a sigh and a hopeful expression on his aged face. Harold, however, stayed firm as he replied in the same cold tone than earlier, "And why should I? Our kinds are enemies. Mr. Anderson, I can see your point of view, but not all shifters took part in that fateful battle. Us, the Quileute tribe, had stayed out of this conflict, but because we were shifters, we have been included in the hatred. Not that I blame your kind." Harold was internally shocked by those revelations, and seeing the look in the old man's face told him that he was telling the truth. "What would I gain from all this?" he asked his visitors with a firm expression on his face. "The pack will not intrude in your territory and we will leave you be," Billy casually responded before glaring at Sam when the young man tried to object. The dark brown-haired young man with blue-green eyes looked back and forth between the two people before him, unsure of what to say next. After a moment of silence, he released a deep sigh. "Very well, but I have a condition." Billy sighed in relief at those words and eagerly nodded his head, willing to hear him out. "I want Jacob to be there for the peace treaty." Sam and Billy blinked in surprise at the unexpected request. "Why?" the wheelchaired old man asked him with a frown on his face. "Because he is the only one of your kind I grew to tolerate at this point," Harold replied with a shrug before adding. "For a mutt, he is a decent bloke." Sam bristled at the insult, but Billy, once again, stopped him from doing something foolish. "Very well Mr. Anderson, we will be back next Sunday for the treaty." Harold nodded firmly at them, not saying anything. He watched as the two intruders left his domain with Sam giving him sharp glares from time to time. Not that it bothered him anyway. However, he couldn't help but feeling that things were going to turn hectic in the future. End of February. Harold sighed heavily as he sat on a bench in the cafeteria. It was one hell of a morning at school, and the dark brown-haired young man was happy to not have a lot of lessons for the evening. Just this morning, he had to endure sports, which wasn't that bad as he was one of the best students, but also something he grew to hate with passion. Arithmetic. Sure, he got good grades, but that doesn't mean he liked the subject. A part of classes, things were good so far, especially with Bella Swan. Their relationship grew even stronger after their little night together. Bella accepted him wholeheartedly for what he was, which was good, but had given him a new nickname in consequence. He was her teddy bear now. While the nickname itself was kinda embarrassing, he could tolerate it as long as she doesn't use it in public. Sadly, she calling him that in front of her friends Angela and Jessica, who found it pretty cute. Girls are evil. However, Harold also had to prepare for another matter, the peace treaty with the wolves. It had been a few days since he met Billy Black and this mutt, what was the name again? Of right Sam, and so far, there were none more trace of the wolves around his domain. Which was good. Beside, he still had 2 good days before their new meeting. He wasn't thrilled at the idea of seeing them again, but hey, at least, he will not have to worry about those mutts anymore. Beside, Jacob would be there, and despite not being a shifter yet, he was a decent guy. Another thing had been keeping him on edge were the vampires. So far, they made no moves against him, but they seemed to be keeping an eye on one of their own, on Edward to be exact. Harold internally growled that he remembered the number of times he caught the vampire looking at Bella like he wanted her as his next meal. Even this morning he had caught him staring. Of course, he would glare dangerously at him as if daring him to do anything, and Edward would answer by sneering at him in both hatred and disdain. Of course, his siblings would always pull him aside to talk with him. One of them would usually stay behind to give him an apologetic look. It was mostly this pixie-like girl. What was her name again? Oh yes, Alice. In response, he would give her a sharp nod before going back on business, which was either school stuffs or keeping an eye on Bella. His mother Astrid had been calling him a lot since he revealed to her that he told his girlfriend and soulmate everything. Needless to say that she had been pleased and somewhat excited to have the talk with her future daughter-in-law. Thankfully, it won't happen before a long time. Of course he had told her about the peace treaty he was about to do with the Quileute tribe and what Billy told him. After a moment of silence, Astrid only said she was proud of him but to still keep a close eye on them for good measure. She wasn't a huge fan of wolves after all. He then later received a call from his grandparents who wanted to know how he was. Of course, they weren't pleased to hear that he lived in the same area than shifters and vampires, but after some explanation, they told him the same thing that his mother, to be careful around them. As if it wasn't enough, Einar had also told him that his destiny will take a turn in the coming year but had refused to say more when asked what he meant. It was really frustrating. But that's what shamans usually rare when they are in cryptic mode. However, there were also good news. Soon winter will end and Ayana will wake up from her hibernation. 3 months without his familiar was hard, but he was used to it by now. He just hoped that she would not greet him with her usual slobbering tongue. Harold shivered at the souvenir of his head in her mouth and his face pressed against the pink muscle that was her tongue. It was not a good experience. Shaking his head to regain his composure, the dark brown-haired young pulled out his lunchbox but didn't have the time to open it when a certain someone practically appeared in thin air behind him with arms wrapped around his neck in a hug. "Hello there, handsome," a certain chocolate-eyed girl he loved whispered into his ears, which sent shivers down his spine. "Hey there, gorgeous," Harold called out softly and a fond smile on his face. His compliment earned him a kiss on the cheek from Bella, who then pulled herself away to seat beside him with her own lunchbox pulled out. Smiling at one another, they both opened their boxes at the same time and almost instantly, Bella started to hum as the smell of her boyfriend's food reached her nose. "What did you make today?" she asked in curiosity while looking at his food with a drooling mouth. "Nothing special, just some chips and salmon," Harold replied with a shrug as if it was unimportant. "Can I some?" Bella asked him with puppy dog eyes. "Chips or fish?" "Fish." Chuckling, Harold handed her a piece of salmon and almost instantly she looked ready to eat it if she had not been stopped by another thing her boyfriend handed her. It was a piece of cake, but not any cake, honey cake. The young woman grew very fond of those ever since Harold had introduced her to it. So far, it was her favorite but followed closely by chocolate cake. "I thought you would like some cake," Harold cooed to her mischievously. Bella pouted at him but took the cake, and her behavior caused him to chuckle a bit before the two of them focused on their foods. They ate in silence, but, when they were about to leave, the sound of someone clearing its throat caught his attention. Turning his head, Harold tensed when he saw who it was: Alice Cullen. The pixie-like vampire looked nervous about being around him good. But deep down, he wondered what she wanted. As never before, she tried to approach him nor Bella in that matter. A quick look toward where the Cullens usually are and he saw that most of them were present minus Edward and Jasper. Emmett looked back at him with the same nervous expression he harbored each time they looked at one another, and the girl Rosalie shot him a dangerous glare. Nothing surprising here. Looking back at Alice, he narrowed his eyes at her as he asked in a cold tone. "Yes." Alice flinched at the tone and even Bella tensed at how could it was, but could understand as herself was looking at the newcomer warily. Ever since Harold told her about the Cullens being true vampires, the young woman had tried her best to stay clear of them even if they fed on animals. BLD. Speaking of Harold, he was looking at Alice with narrowed eyes as he waited for an answer. The pixie-like vampire took a few seconds to regain her composure before looking back at him and saying, "Can I talk with you? Alone?" She glanced at Bella at the last part. The young woman in question looked ready to say something, but Harold beat her to it by stating calmly, "She already knows." Alice, however, didn't seem totally surprised by his answer because she only nodded in acceptance before walking away to the outside. Bella and Harold glanced at one another, wondering what the hell was that about before the latter picked up his stuff to follow the vampire. Himself followed by his girlfriend's soulmate who was wondering what this girl wanted with her teddy bear. They followed Alice to a secluded area of the school where no one usually came before facing the vampire when she stopped to face them. Alice was only 4 feet 10 inches in height, so she was literally a dwarf compared to them, as Bella stood 5 feet 4 inches and Harold as the tallest 6 feet 5 inches. The vampire stared at the young man with hesitation as her eyes showed no fear but nervousness and a bit of fear. Harold could understand it as he was clearly intimidating but still kept a scowl on his face as he stared down at her. For a moment, nothing could be heard between the three of them until... "What do you want?" Harold finally asked the pixie-like vampire in a demanding tone as beside him, Bella looked at her with narrowed eyes. Alice took a deep breath before answering, "I came to warn you about Edward." "Your brother?" Bella asked her with a frown. "Yes, he is obsessed with you," Alice answered calmly while looking at the only human of the trio. Bella's face instantly went pale as if she had seen a ghost, and Harold couldn't retain himself from pulling her against him in a protective embrace. "Why?" he asked the vampire girl with sternness. "Honestly, no one know, he told us nothing." Alice's replies was said in a rather upset tone, something that both Harold and Bella had caught. They glanced at one another briefly before looking back at the vampire when she spoke again. "Me and my family do not want to have trouble with you," the pixie-like girl said to Harold, who internally blinked at those unexpected but didn't show it. "That's why I decided to warn you both." Harold and Bella looked at the vampire girl dead in the eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. However, the dark brown-haired young man opened his mouth to ask with a raised brow. "You didn't came here just for that, did you?" "Carlisle, my adoptive father, he wants to meet you to discuss a peace treaty between our coven and you," Alice responded in a soft tone while gulping a bit in nervousness. Bella gaped at the vampire, shocked by those words, before slowly turning her head toward her boyfriend to see how he was taking this, and was a bit scared by what she saw. Harold's face showed no emotion as he looked down at the pixie girl in front of him. His blue-green eyes had hardened dangerously and Alice was starting to become very nervous. "Where and when?" he finally asked with clenched teeth after a moment of dead silence. Alice and Bella both blinked at the unexpected words. They both had assumed that he would have attacked the former or refusing to meet more vampires. "Wherever and whenever you want. Carlisle knows that you might be busy," the pixie-like vampire instantly responded to him. Harold closed his eyes with a deep breath. Just this Sunday, he had a treaty to make with the wolves, now he had to do another one with the vampires. While he wanted nothing more than to tear down the abominations, he didn't want to take the chance of seeing Bella getting hurt. In his internal conflict, as if the Great Bear herself heard him, an idea popped into his mind. "I see very well, tell the head of your coven that I will agree to the treaty, let just say Sunday in the evening at my home." Alice nodded her head and was about to say more when he interrupted her. "But on one condition." "Which is?" "To keep Edward on leash. If you plan to bring him with you, you better keep an eye on him or else the treaty won't happen," the dark brown-haired young man said to Alice in the sternest tone he could muster. The pixie-like vampire quickly nodded in acceptance, pretty intimidated by his little action. "Anything else?" he asked her with a raised brow. She shook her head in response. "Good," Harold grunted before leaving. Alice and Bella only stood there, watching him go before the former looked at the latter. "He is pretty aggressive," the vampire whispered to her fellow girl, who shrugged. "Only to vampires and wolves, otherwise he is a big softy." "I am not." Harold's outraged voice echoed from the distance and the two giggled in amusement. "Thank you for well, you know," Bella hesitantly said to the vampire, who smiled back at her before answering. "It was the right thing to do. You know, you are not so bad for a vampire. Maybe we can." "We can what?" "Friends." Alice blinked at the unexpected question but soon allowed a tiny smile on her face. "I would love to, but I don't think your boyfriend will appreciate seeing you with his enemies," the vampire said to the human with a bit of sadness. "I will talk to him, I'm sure he will come around," Bella replied with a shrug. "Come on, Belle, or we will be late." Harold's voice echoed again, and this time it was not in annoyance but in hurry. "Gotta go." See you. Bella quickly said to the vampire before running away to where her boyfriend was waiting for her. Alice giggled a bit at what just occurred but then left to go back to the cafeteria and tell her family the news. Time skip. It was Sunday and Harold was sitting on the porch, waiting for Billy Black, his son Jacob and the mutt Sam to come so they could make this treaty once and for all. However, the dark brown-haired young man hoped that the old man would tell him how to proceed as he never done this before. Well, there's a first time at everything as they said. Shaking his head to get rid of his nervousness, he tensed when he heard footsteps coming closer but then slightly relaxed when he saw it was none other than the people he was waiting for. Billy looked grave but somewhat hopeful, maybe he was hoping everything would be good, while his son looked at him with seriousness but still allowed a friendly smile on his face. Sam was, by far, the only one who harbored a look of distrust, suspicion and a bit of disgust. Between their first meeting and now, Billy must have told the mutt about his kind, so it was no surprise to get such a reactions. Harold shot him a dangerous glare before looking at the other two with a calm expression on his face. However, he did nodded a greeting to Jacob, who nodded back in response. Mr. Anderson, Billy greeted the younger man in a respectful tone. Mr. Black, Harold replied back in a cold but respectful tone before looking at Sam with a scowl. It seems you bring your son to this meeting, good, but did you have to bring the mutt back? It's starting to smell badly now. Sam bristled in anger at the insult as he gritted his teeth in anger while glaring daggers at the young man before him. However, like last time, Harold didn't look intimidated by this, as a deeper scowl formed on his face along with a glint of excitement shining in his blue-green eyes. Enough. Sam, stop it. Billy hissed angrily but hurriedly to the shifter as he noticed the look in the werebear's eyes. Sam looked ready to stop, but seeing the look in both Billy's and Jacob's eyes he listened to them. However, that didn't stop him from glaring daggers at the young man who insulted him. A young man who was, again, not bothered by his look in the slightest. Can we enter, Mr. Anderson? Billy calmly asked the young werebear, who only nodded his head in response as he gestured for them to come inside. Billy nodded at their host with respect when the latter helped him with his wheelchair. Jacob, shook hands with his friend before following after his father. As Sam passed by, the two of them glared at one another challengingly. Sam was an inch taller than him, but it didn't matter to him. Besides, he hadn't got his growth spurt yet. Hopefully it would happen sooner rather than later. The next 2 hours were nothing but talks and discussions. In the end, the treaty was made, but Jacob had to stop Sam from lunging at their host when Harold said some remark about wolves. Once the treaty was made, the young werebear led them all outside his home where they bid their farewells. What was in the agreement, you may wonder? Well, here's some points. The wolves are not allowed in Harold's domain unless it is important. It was about vampires and the danger they represent to humans and themselves, something both wolves and werebears agreed on. Jacob was the exception, seeing that he had a good relationship with the young werebear. Harold was not allowed on Quileute land. It was far to both parties unless it was absolutely necessary. However, he can enter as long as he accompanied by Jacob Black. Neither of the parties are allowed to tell humans about their respective species as long as they stick to the treaty. The treaty by itself was not really difficult, but to be sure that it was respected, Harold had insisted on something: BLD Pact. It was generally used for serious agreements and considered a much stronger binding than a signature. Billy had been hesitant at first but then respected the young man's wishes. Both him and Harold cut the palm of their hands before shaking one another, mixing their BLD. Thankfully, none of them would have side effect of this, meaning that Harold will not be part wolf and Billy will not be a werebear. Back to present, Harold watched as his 3 guests left his domain with an emotionless face. While he was internally glad that he will not have to deal with the wolves, he couldn't help but being a bit suspicious. Bears and wolves aren't made to be friends after all. And seeing the looks he received from Sam, it was as clear as water that it will never be the case between the two of them. Once the trio disappeared from his sight, he returned inside to take a short nap before he had to deal with another treaty he was not looking forward for, with the vampires. At the same time, far away from this place, a discussion was taking place between the members of the Cullen family. "So who will you take with you, Carlisle?" Emmett asked the head of the family from his place. "Me and Esme are going obviously, however, both you and Rosalie aren't," the doctor began to say before being interrupted by someone. "Why?" Rosalie asked him with slight indignation and anger. "For many reasons," Carlisle started to say before his wife took over in a gentle tone. "Firstly, because we don't think it is a good idea for Emmett to come because of Mr. Anderson being a bear." Emmett tensed at the reminder and Rosalie comforted him for a minute before looking back at her adoptive parents. "And me? Someone told us how you would look hostilely at Mr. Anderson. We do not want things to turn down because of your animosity with him," Carlisle responded calmly with firmly. Rosalie, hearing this, glared daggers at Jasper and Alice, who was not far from her. The former looked away innocently while Alice whistled a tune she heard recently, acting like nothing was happening. Carlisle and Esme shared an amused look before going back on matters. "Alice and Jasper will come, the doctor began to say until another person stepped in. "Can I come instead?" It was Edward. Esme and Carlisle, along with Alice, all tensed at the question, but then the former quickly regained her composure to answer in a calm and gentle tone. "Edward the First, don't think this is a good idea." "Why?" "I was there at the last treaty," Edward retorted with indignation while crossing his arms over his chest. "He got a point there," Jasper mumbled in agreement before flinching when he received a glare from Alice, Rosalie, and Emmett. "But you and Mr. Anderson have already enemies. If you come with us, the treaty will never happen." Carlisle explained in a calm tone, but deep down he was alarmed. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he allowed Edward to accompany them to this meeting. A shiver passed through his body at the thought of enraging a werbear. A species even the vultures tried to stay away from. Alice had reported them the young man's words about Edward, and because of this, they wanted to keep him away from the meeting to not create tensions between them. But he will have to change his plan, as knowing Edward, he would follow them regardless. "And what if I promise to not start anything? Heck, you can even let Jasper come as bodyguard," Edward almost pleaded to his adoptive parents. Alice, Rosalie, Emmett and Jasper were all wondering what he had in mind. It was no surprise of how much he hated Harold Anderson, so to see him willingly wanting to meet the guy he hated was a shock. Alice's eyes narrowed as she looked at her brother with suspicions. There was clearly a motive behind this. Carlisle and Esme looked at one another, wondering what to do. The female head of the family nodded her head once at her husband, who sighed deeply before looking back at Edward. "Very well, you can come with us. Alice and Jasper will accompany us to keep a close eye on you." The concerned duo blinked at Carlisle's words but nodded their heads in acceptance. However, they then secretly glanced at one another before nodding in determination. They didn't know what Edward planned, but they will do their best to stop it, or else things will get ugly for the whole family. And they had every right to be concerned, as Edward was internally smirking evilly at Carlisle's decision. Time skip. "I'm coming," Harold called out as he rushed toward the front door to greet whoever it was. It was the evening, 3 p.m. to be precise, and so far, there was no sight of the vampires. In fact, the sound of his doorbell caught him off guard as he had been peacefully watching TV. "You took you dash," the dark brown-haired young man started to say coldly as he opened the door before stopping when he saw who was on his porch. It was not a vampire but his girlfriend, Bella Swan herself. "Bella, what are you doing here?" Harold asked her with shock while quickly pulling her inside. "I came to visit you, of course. Don't you remember that I have dash? A meeting with the Cullens." "Yes, I remember." Bella finished for him with a shrug and a sigh. "Then why?" Harold asked her in a softer tone as he used a finger to make her look at him in the eyes. "Because I wanted to be there. I couldn't stop thinking that something bad was going to happen to you." Bella responded in a whisper. "Nothing will happen to me, never," the dark brown-haired young man cooed back at her before kissing her forehead. Bella smiled back at him, but the moment she was about to kiss him back, someone knocked at the door, causing the two to tense at the unexpected sense. "Quick! Hide upstairs. They must not know you are here. Especially if Edward is here." Harold hissed to his girlfriend, who nodded at him once before climbing the staircase. He watched her go for a second, and once she was out of sight, Harold opened the door, revealing a large group of people. He recognized some of them: Jasper Hale, Alice Cullen, and to his frustration Edward Cullen. The second his eyes locked with his nemesis, he wanted nothing more than to tear him down, but remained calm even if the look of disgust in Edward's eyes was unnerving him. Looking away from him, Harold's eyes landed on the two people accompanying the trio. The two in question were unknown to him, but he had a good guess of who they were. The 6 feet 2 inches tall man with collar-length blonde hair and kind yellow eyes must be Carlisle Cullen, and the caramel-colored woman beside him with a compassionate look on her heart-shaped face must be his wife, Esme Cullen. "I was starting to think that you weren't coming," Harold commented to them while crossing his arms over his chest, narrowing his blue-green eyes at them all. "Apologize, but Carlisle began to say before being interrupted by the young man in question. "And I see you bring him here." Harold was sneering toward Edward at those words before adding with a shrug, commenting, "As long as you keep him in leash." Edward looked ready to lunge at the young werbear, but thanks to both Alice and Jasper, he didn't. Carlisle and Esme had also shot him a warning look. They weren't here to fight after all. "Mr. Anderson? Is it possible for us to come inside to talk?" Esme asked the young werbear, who stared at her with a raised brow when she called his name. "Of course, but one wrong move," Harold started to say menacingly before pausing as he glared at them all. The vampires nodded in understanding, except Edward, who scowled only to reluctantly agreeing when Jasper strongly nudged him on the ribs. Satisfied by their answers, Harold led them inside toward the living room. Alice and Esme couldn't help but admiring the place. Despite being made of wood, this house was cozy and rather welcoming. "Nice place you got there, Mr. Anderson," Alice commented to their hosts once they all sat on the sofas. "Thank you, now time for business," Harold replied to the pixie-like vampire before becoming serious again as he stared at Carlisle and Esme Cullen. "As you might have been told, we want to make peace with you to prevent trouble between us," the head of the family began to say before his wife took over in a gentle tone. "We do not want to see your children getting hurt." Harold looked back and forth between the two, seeing the concern in their eyes before taking a deep breath. "I can understand that," he responded with a nod before adding seriously. "Here are my points. First of all, I do not want to see any one of you on my territory. You are not allowed to hunt there either." "That understandable," Carlisle nodded at the young man, and the other vampires except Edward did the same. "Secondly, he is not allowed around my soulmate." The word "he" was said just as he pointed at Edward, whose eyes narrowed in anger and hatred at him in response. "Bella is your soulmate?" Alice asked in shock at the new. "Yes, and we both know it. Are you agreeing with this point?" Harold said to Alice before saying the rest to Carlisle and Esme. The answer was of course to be expected. "We do." They both replied while shooting a warning look at Edward, who looked ready to object. The vampire looked at Jasper and Alice, who were shooting him the same look than their adoptive parents. Edward internally fumed but reluctantly nodded. Harold's eyes narrowed at him but then focused back on the others as he said the next words. "If you respect those terms, then you have nothing to fear from me." Carlisle and Esme looked at one another. The terms were fair and reasonable. Even Alice and Jasper thought the same, but then someone else spoke, someone who should have stayed silent. "And why should we listen to you?" It was Edward F. Cullen. "Maybe because you are in my home?" Harold retorted in a stern tone as he stood on his full size, glaring down at the vampire in front of him. "Edward, stop this." Carlisle hissed to him in anger and panic as Jasper tried to pull his adoptive brother away from the angry werbear. "No. I will not stop. We are more than him. We should kick him out." Edward snarled back in frustration while struggling under Jasper's grips. "I would love to see you try." Harold responded to him with a dark smirk. Carlisle, Esme, Jasper, Edward and Alice all tensed at the growl-like voice the dark brown-haired young man used, and they all stood there in silence. Harold then swiftly turned his head toward Carlisle before saying, "You should have left him to your home. The treaty is OFF. Esme, hearing this, instantly opened her mouth to say, please. Reconsider. Why should I? Harold angrily asked her. Before Esme could answer, her husband turned his head to look at one of his children. Jasper. Take him home now. Carlosel ordered in a stern tone. The vampire in question nodded his head before knocking his brother down and making his way out of the house with the unconscious body of Edward Cullen. Alice accompanied them to open the front door, leaving Harold, Carlisle and Esme behind. Can we talk seriously now? The head of the Cullen family said to the werbear with a pained look on his face. Now we can, Harold responded, still in a growl-like tone. Upstairs, Bella listened to everything that was said or done. She was shocked by Edward's behavior and promised to never approach him in the future while also promising to stand by her soulmate's side. A few days had passed since his meeting with both the Quilutes and the vampires and so far all parties were respecting the treaty. After Edward had been taken away, Carlisle, Esme and Alice could peacefully talk with the young werbear and in the end, the treaty was made. Once they left, Bella climbed downstairs and the two lovers had promised each other to keep an eye on the vampire boy. Then she asked him if he minded her befriending Alice Cullen. Of course, he was totally against it, but after a short argument, their first one, Harold reluctantly let her as long as the pixie-like vampire doesn't try anything funny against her. Back to present, it was the beginning of March and Harold was preparing some food for lunch, beef and chips for him and kokanee salmons for a certain someone who could wake up at any moment. He had caught a lot of them the day before during a trip near the river. His stocks of fishes were good, but with his familiar who will soon wake up from her hibernation he had to double it in preparation. A part of him was excited because Ayanna would finally meet his soulmate, but another part was worried of how the blonde bear would take the news of him having a peace treaty with the enemies. Shaking his head to get rid of those thoughts, Harold went back to his cooking, but his mind then went to Bella. She had, like she said, befriend Alice Cullen and the two could sometimes been seen together at school when the former wasn't around him. Himself grew to appreciate the pixie-like vampire mostly because of her bubbly and optimistic personality. That and she made Bella happy, so it was good in his opinion. Alice had presented the two to Jasper and at first, it was a bit tense to both parties, but then things went smooth. He and Jasper would have long conversation about philosophy or historical matters while the girls would bond over girl stuffs like shopping or things similar. Then he got to meet Emmett and Rosalie, and again, it was tense at first as the former vampire looked a bit hesitant of him while the second hadn't stopped glaring at him. When he asked Alice, he was a bit shocked to hear that Emmett had died from a bear attack, and with him being part bear bad souvenirs must have resurfaced. Rosalie was the one who saved and so became really protective of Emmett, so that's why she disliked him, because of he was part bear, a creature who caused her mate's death. However, that didn't stop him from growling or glaring at her each time their eyes met. Mainly because Rosalie seemed to dislike Bella for some reasons. He didn't want to ask Alice as it wasn't his problem, but he made sure to keep an eye on the girl every now and then. Something that changed was the enmity between himself and Edward grew even more, and even the students at school saw it, which caused rumors. Some said that Edward must have tried to RPE Bella and that's why Harold hated him, some said that Harold must have done something bad to the guy. A few were saying that it somehow concerned Bella. Yeah, you heard right, some people believed that Bella was the reason the two hated one another. Edward loved her but she chose Harold, which resulted in the two being hostile toward one another. Regardless, the rumors were pretty much ignored by Harold but not by Edward, whose hatred toward went higher to the point that he would openly sneer at him. Bella and Alice sometimes had to stop Harold from attacking the guy and pummel him. A growl escaped Harold's throat as he thought of Edward Cullen and did the right he always do when he was angry, take a trip into the forest. But first, he needed to finish his cooking, didn't want to have it cold after all. When it was done, he went out of his house before heading toward the forest in a hurry as his fists were clenched with anger. Thinking of Edward always angered him. Even Sam the Mutt wasn't as annoying. Back to present, the second he entered the woods, he changed into his full bear form before dashing away to the river. The snow was slowly melting, but spring will not be there before a little while. His huge dark brown form was a contrast with the whiteness of the area as he ran through the woods toward the river which was now flooding freely. The massive bear stopped at the shore before roaring loudly to the sky. A roar filled with anger. He roared for at least 30 seconds before stopping to catch his breath. He usually do this when he was angry, roaring out his anger. However, he was still not calmed down, so he decided to do another thing. The massive bear slowly entered the cold water and he couldn't help but shivering at the temperature as he kept diving until his head and shoulders were the only things still outside the surface. The cold water literally cooled him down and he felt himself relaxing for a minute. His anger faded away at the calming sound of flooding water and he wholeheartedly enjoyed this moment of peace and quiet. Harold, however, blinked when he felt something brushing his side and plunged his head underwater to soon what it was. To his surprise and internal delight, it was fishes. But not any fishes, but kokanee salmons. Unlike their larger relative, the sockeye salmon, one of Harold's and Ayana's favorites, this fish do not go out to the ocean but spend their entire life in fresh water. His instincts took over for a moment and Harold tried to catch some of them as they passed by his large body. It was not an easy task when you tried to catch a fish in its element. How does a bear usually catch fishes? Easy. When the ursine feels a fish in the water, it quickly pin it to the stream bottom or against their body with their paws before biting it. Only then, the bear would begin to eat. That's exactly what Harold was currently doing. He waited for the perfect time to strike, and when a rather large salmon passed a bit to close his paws, quickly pulled the fish against his chest, and before the salmon had a chance to escape, Harold's jaws fell on it like wave on sand. The massive bear, however, realized that his head was too large and he might accidentally swallow the fish whole. He saw his mother doing this and did not want it to do the same. In consequences, Harold turned into his anthropomorphic form, smaller than the precedent but faster. His jaws clamped around the salmon's scaly form as he made his out of the water to the shore, where he started to feast on what he just caught. Unlike cats, bears had a strong digestive system that allowed them to eat pretty much everything in a fish, bones included. Harold slowly ate his fish, enjoying the taste despite it being raw and not cooked. It wasn't the first time he ate raw meat or raw fish, as his mother Astrid taught him that no matter what, it was still food. Contrary to normal humans, bears tend to snack between meals. Of course, some of them practice sports to stay in shape. After a moment, Harold finished his salmon and instantly looked at the water, where he saw dozens of forms under the surface. After all, it doesn't hurt to catch a few more, right? Time skip. Harold sighed in pleasure as he finished what remained of the 10th salmon he caught. He didn't know for how long he had been fishing, but he felt good. Now he was laying against a rock, his stomach full of fishes. Thankfully, he still had at least 3 hours to wait before eating dinner, so he had time digesting his food. Besides, he still wanted to enjoy the peace and calming sounds of nature. However, after a moment, he suddenly tensed as he caught a strange scent carried by the cool wind. A deep growl escaped his throat as the bear looked toward where it came from before following it to its source. He had recognized the smell and his body was filled with anger and hatred. Vampires were in the area. However, whoever they were, it was without a doubt not a member of the Cullen family. What he didn't know was that a certain person he loved dearly was currently in the forest looking for him. Who was it? His girlfriend and soulmate Isabella, Bella Swan. Her father, Charlie, had allowed her to see her girlfriend, but when she knocked at his door, no one answered. Bella, instead of sitting on the porch to wait, decided to take a little trip around the woods. She knew that with Harold being a bear and having his scent on her, a lot of the animals, especially the most dangerous ones, would think twice before attacking her. In addition, the Cullens weren't allowed on his lands because of the treaty, and it was the same for the local shifters, so in her mind, she had nothing to worry about. She was so wrong. Because unknown to her, 3 people were moving graciously through the woods. The 3 of them were vampires, with 2 men and 1 woman. The woman was 5 feet 6 inches tall and had long, curly, brilliant orange hair similar to fire, along with blood red eyes of a vampire. She also possessed a stucked, feline-like beauty, and like the cats, she moved with perfect, lethal steps. The first man was 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build and average looking, which made his appearance less appealing than the Cullen. There was nothing remarkable about his face or body at all, in fact. He also possessed light brown hair cropped short, and burgundy eyes. His outfit comprised of blue jeans and a pale blue shirt, both frayed with wear. He looked to be barefoot. The last man was 5 feet 9 inches tall, with glossy black hair, a slight olive tone to his pale skin and dark hair. He had a medium, slightly muscular frame and an easy smile. Like his fellow man, he was barefoot. The three of them were moving with graces in the world of trees, grasses, and bushes, but then the brown-haired man stopped in his track as he smelled the air. His two companions stopped when they noticed it. "James, what's going on?" the woman asked him with some curiosity. "There is a human nearby." A female, the vampire, whose name was apparently James, responded with a sadistic grin on his face. The woman blinked but then smelled the air and instantly caught a delightful scent. The other man must have smelt it too, because he was looking everywhere to find where it came from. "Let's have some fun," James hissed to his companions with sadistic excitement as he dashed away from their spot, followed by his comrades. As they ran, the olive-skinned vampire was grinning toothily, exposing his white fangs, while the woman looked just as bloodthirsty. Even James looked excited at the prospect of feeding on the human whose smell was simply too delicious to be ignored, even if it wasn't the tastiest scent they even smell. Back to Bella, she was walking through the woods, staring at the nature around her, enjoying the silence. The young woman was unaware of the creatures heading her way as her attention was focused on the things around her. Which was one of her biggest mistakes, as her attention shifted away from the appealing nature to something else. "Hello there," a sweet masculine voice echoed from nearby. Alarmed, Bella turned her head to see who talked, only to froze when she saw 3 people standing a few feet away from her, a woman and 2 men. All of them were looking at her with those red eyes of theirs. Wait, red eyes? Bella, at the sight of them, froze in horror when she realized that she was facing vampires. And from what Harold told her, red-eyed vampires meant that they drink human blood. "Don't you know it is rather rude to not greet back?" the olive-skinned vampire asked her with a small grin on his face. "Does it matter if she answers you or not, Lauren? She is human after all," the woman replied with disdain before looking back at Bella with a smirk that sent shivers down the girl's spine. James smirked at his coven-mates before looking at Bella, who had taken a few steps back in fright. "No, no, no, my dear, do not fear us, we just want to play with you," he cooed evilly to the frightened woman, who backed away further at those words. "What do you have in mind, James?" the vampire woman asked him with a raised brow. "My dear Victoria James began to say to the now named Victoria, only to be interrupted by Bella, who gathered all her courage to hiss angrily. "I will not play with the likes of you, vampires." Victoria and Lauren snarled at her and were about to lunge forward, but were stopped by a calm if not amused James. "So you know about us?" he asked her with a raised brow. "I already met some of your kind, yes," Bella retorted coldly while taking another step back. "Really? Interesting," James muttered to himself before adding. "Thank you for the information, sweetheart, but I'm afraid it is not enough to keep you alive." At the last words, Victoria licked her lips with anticipation, as if she was imagining feasting on her corpse. Lauren looked at Bella with contained excitement himself. Seeing this, Bella became more alarmed and afraid, so she blurted out rather shakily. "Harold will destroy you all if you touch me." "I don't who's this Harold, but a human will never hurt a vampire," James replied arrogantly with a shrug of indifference. At his side, Victoria snorted in amusement at the other girl's comment, while Lauren frowned. Bella gulped her loudly in nervousness as she backed away again, only to trip over a little rock on the ground. Yelping in surprise, she fell on her back and instantly crawled away from the vampires who were slowly approaching her. "You know what? I can't take it anymore. She smelt too good." Lauren hissed with hunger as he lunged forward. Bella, however, tossed some mud under the snow. There was somehow a bit of mud in his eyes, causing him to yelp in surprise as he backed away from her. The young human woman used this opportunity to run away as fast as she could, leaving behind the vampires who looked at her with slight anger. James, however, looked amused, as he looked at the running human before shouting loudly in a sadistic tone. "Go ahead. Run far. Make it more fun for us." Just as he finished those words, they lunged forward, leaving behind Laurent, who was furious at what the human did to him. After pulling away the mud on his eyes, he quickly went after his coven mate, eager to teach this girl a lesson before drinking her warm blood. As Bella ran, she felt like she was followed and so slightly turned her head to look above her shoulders, only to become frantic when she saw the vampires tailing her. "Harold!" She screamed loudly in alarm as she ran even faster. Not far away from there, her boyfriend, still in his anthropomorphic form, stopped dead on his tracks when he heard the cry, and his blood turned cold when he recognized the voice. It was Bella's. "Bella! Hold on. I'm coming," Harold said in a cavernous tone as he ran on all four toward where the cry came from. He had to move faster. Back to Bella, she was still running from her life as the three vampires were still after her. For a moment, she wondered why they haven't caught up with her yet, after vampires were faster than humans and not slower. But then she remembered their behaviors and realized that they were playing with her. She was so focused on this that she didn't notice the root on the ground until it was too late. Yelping when she felt her foot crashing against something, she fell forward on her stomach with a grunt of slight pain. Widening her eyes, she turned around to face her pursuers, only to see them standing a few away from her, staring at her with toothy smirks on their faces. "Look like playtime is over," James cooed sweetly as his red eyes looked at their victim in sadistic pleasure. "Let me have her first, James. She must pay for throwing mud on me," Laurent angrily demanded to his fellow man as his eyes glared at the pale form of Bella Swan. "Hey, women first. I want a piece of her," Victoria hissed back as she looked at Bella with hunger clear on her face. James opened his mouth to say something but was interrupted by a growl-like voice echoing from nearby. "Why don't you start with me?" Looking toward where it came from, James didn't have the time to react when a furious anthropomorphic brown bear appeared with a cavernous roar before swiping at the vampire, who was sent crashing hard against a tree, who broke at the impact. His two companions stared toward where he fell and were shocked to see him laying on the ground, unmoving. Turning away from his fellow coven mate's body, Laurent looked at the creature with nothing but pure terror as he backed away from it. "James!" Victoria cried out in shock before looking at the newcomer with wide eyes of fright as he towered above her while standing protectively in front of Bella, who released a sigh of relief. "First, you trespass on my territory," the werbear snarled in anger as he took a step forward. Laurent and Victoria took 2 steps backwards. "Then you try to hurt my soulmate." Another step forward for the werbear and 2 backwards for the vampires. "Give me one reason why I should kill you," Harold roared at them as he glared daggers at the 2 vampires who seemed to cower under his rage. However, before one of the 2 could answer, someone else stepped in. "How does it feel to be faced with stronger than you?" It was Bella, who had been looking at the scene with a smirk on her face as she looked at the bloodsuckers. Victoria and Laurent glared at her hatefully for those words, and forgetting that a mass of fur was there, the male vampire lunged forward. Bella released a scream of fright just as Harold grabbed the vampire by the throat with his clawed left hand. Effortlessly lifting him, Harold bring him to eye level where red eyes met blue-green. "You shouldn't have done that, leech." The werbear snarled the last words with disgust as he tightened his hold around Laurent's throat, causing the latter to struggle madly to escape. But it was futile, as soon, Harold literally broke his neck, killing him instantly. Victoria stared at the scene with horror, but before she could move, she found herself in the creature's shadow. "What will you do now, woman?" Harold asked her with a cavernous growl as he towered above her. The orange-haired vampire instantly regained her composure at those words and hissed threateningly at the werbear, who smirked in response, not intimidated in the slightest. Something that unnerved the vampire woman greatly. With a cry, she lunged at him, but the large beast swiftly moved out of the way, and just as Victoria was about to turn around, he struck. With a thunderous roar, Harold lunged at her and clamped his jaws around her left shoulder, which caused her to scream in agony as his fangs pierced her skin. She tried to push him away but couldn't. Harold then did something that frightened the vampire. Using his hands, he grabbed her legs while pushing his head backward while still having his jaws clamped around Victoria's shoulders. The orange-haired vampire released a screech of agony when the werbear separated her body in two with a roar. The top part of her body landed right now to Lauren's dead corpse while the other part was tossed aside like garbage. "Victoria, no!" A masculine voice cried out in anger from nearby, and Harold turned his furry head to see none other than James. He had been knocked down when he crashed against that tree and had regained consciousness the second Harold was about to cut Victoria in two. Needless to say that seeing his mate being killed right under his eyes by this creature filled him with anger and revenge. "You will pay for that, you freak!" James roared in anger as he lunged at the werbear, who tensed at the word freak. This simple word filled him with memories he wished to have forgot, memories of people he wanted to forget forever, the Dursleys. Images of the past started to fill his brain and a deep growl erupted from his throat as he glared at the coming vampire. James, however, was too blinded by his anger to notice the hatred in the beast's eyes until a dark brown fist crashed against the left side of his face. Harold, in one swift movement, punched the vampire in the face, sending James tumbling on the ground. "You and your friends shouldn't have tried to touch Bella," Harold growled out as he cracked his knuckles while approaching James. "Because now this is gonna hurt." The vampy didn't have time to react when the werbear fell on him with a roar. James screamed in pain when Harold mauled him with not only his claws but his fangs as well. First, his hands were cut, then his arms. "Prepare for your death, leech." Harold snarled as he raised his right clawed hands to strike. A second later, James' head was cut out of the main body in a swift movement, ending his life once and for all. The werbear looked at the corpses of the vampires who tried to kill his girlfriend with satisfaction before looking at the sky as he released a triumphant roar that echoed throughout the forest. Bella looked at her boyfriend with wide eyes, then at the vampires on the ground. He killed them so easily and so fast. Harold was really the strongest. Her heart was filled with warmth as she looked at her boyfriend. Just as she felt really bad, he put himself in danger to save her again. She wasn't as strong as him, but maybe she could become stronger. A feeling of determination spread through her body, her longing to become a werbear grew, and she will be one. "Bella!" Harold's call for her broke the young woman in her thought, and her chocolate eyes looked up to see her boyfriend back in human form looking at her in concern. "Harold! Thanks, Callisto, you are safe." The dark brown-haired young man whispered in relief as he pulled her into a hug. Bella smiled at her boyfriend before hugging him back tightly. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered in his ears. "I would lay down my life for you," was his answer. Her heart was filled with warmth at those words but also horror as she didn't want to imagine a life without him. That's why she tightened her embrace on him, pressing her head against his shoulder. For a moment, nothing was said as the two held one another, no wanting to break the embrace. Until... "Harold?" Bella called him out softly. "Yes, love. I want to be like you." "Huh?" He looked at her with confusion. "I want to be a werbear like you," Bella clarified her words, and his eyes widened in shock as those words reached his ears. "Why?" "I want to be stronger. I want to be able to defend myself against creatures like..." Bella paused in her explanation to stare at James' body. Harold nodded in understanding but couldn't retain himself from asking, "Are you sure this is what you want? You cannot tell Charlie about this." "I don't care if it means being stronger and being closer to you, then I would do anything." Bella's response was filled with determination as a fire was burning in her chocolate eyes. Harold looked hesitant for a moment as he looked at his soulmate, then at the vampires. For a long time, he was thinking, and Bella looked at him with concern that her boyfriend was about to refuse her wish. After a moment of silence, a deep sigh escaped Harold's throat before his blue-green eyes looked back at her with a tiny smile. "Very well, I will see what I can do for you." "Does this mean?" Bella asked him with growing happiness. "Yes, if you want to become one of us, then I will help you to the better of my ability." Harold answered back with a chuckle. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bella kissed him again and again with happiness as she shouted those words. Anything for you, love, Harold whispered to her gently before kissing her on the lips. Bella smiled as she returned the gesture, ignoring her surrounding as her main focus was kissing her boyfriend. Now come on, let's head back home, Harold declared softly once he broke the kiss before leading his girlfriend to his domain so they could enjoy the rest of the day in relative peace. As Bella walked beside him, her mind was filled with happiness. Soon she will be like the man she loved, a strong werbear. Soon she will not be an easy prey for vampires to feast on, she will be ready. And if this meant not telling her father anything about this, so be it. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 6. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Asian Lionheart 310 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.